Blood stained his fur. The leash dangled limp between his teeth. Across the courtroom, a man crumbled into his chair, tears carving lines through a mask of arrogance. No one moved. No one spoke. Only the sound of the dog's steady breathing filled the silence, louder than any gavel, sharper than any sentence. He had no badge, no voice, but he had delivered the verdict long before the judge did. And behind him, a little girl stood, trembling but unbroken, clutching the scarred warrior who had refused to let her be forgotten. You thought heroes wore capes. You thought salvation walks on 4 battered legs, scarred and silent, loyal beyond life itself. This is not the story you expected. This is the story of a dog who did what no one else could. He remembered, he fought, and when everyone else had given up, If you're ready to uncover the truth behind the scar, the leash, and the howl that shattered a monster's empire, stay with us. Like the video if you're already hooked, subscribe for the full journey, and tell us in the comments where are you watching from and what moment do you think changed everything. The heavy oak doors creaked open with a slow, resonant groan that sent a ripple through the crowded courtroom. Every head turned in synchronized curiosity as Lena Brooks stepped inside, her tiny frame dwarfed by the cavernous space. In her right hand she clutched tightly onto a worn leash, the frayed leather straining under the pressure of her small, trembling fingers. At the other end of the leash, Shadow, a scarfed German shepherd, moved with deliberate precision. His movements were silent, but his posture was rigid, alert, every muscle coiled beneath his battered coat. A long, jagged scar ran along his flank, a silent testament to battles fought and survived. The collective murmur of the audience stilled, giving way to a heavy silence as if the room itself was holding its breath. Lena's emerald eyes flickered nervously around the courtroom, briefly catching the sympathetic gaze of Judge Warren Mills, who leaned forward ever so slightly on the bench. He didn't need a docket to know. The fragile burden of justice, of truth itself, now rested squarely on the fragile shoulders of this 5-year-old girl. Victor Lane, seated smugly at the defense table, followed Lena's entrance with an expression of faint amusement. His attorney, Martin Shaw, whispered something close to his ear, but Victor didn't seem to listen. His gaze was locked on Lena and momentarily on the dog. Shadow's ears twitched. His body stiffened. Without a sound, the dog's hackles lifted, his brown eyes narrowing into a predatory stare aimed directly at Victor. Dated in that instant. Shadow had sensed something vile, something rotten that no eye could see. The room's unease rippled outward like an invisible wave, barely suppressed. A mother in the back clutched her child closer. A reporter lowered his pen, sensing a story deeper than mere legal proceedings. Lena hesitated at the center aisle, then continued her slow march toward the witness stand. Her small tennis shoes made no noise against the polished floor, but the tension was deafening. As she approached the stand, she stumbled slightly, not from clumsiness, but from the invisible weight crushing her tiny form. The leash in her hand tightened instinctively, fingers curling so hard that her knuckles turned white. Burst subtly but forcefully. At that exact moment, Shadow emitted a low, guttural growl. It was not the loud, warning bark of a startled dog. It was deeper, darker, a primal acknowledgement of a presence that spelled danger. Shadow's growl rumbled through the courtroom like distant thunder, and Judge Mills' hand hesitated above his gavel, ready to restore order but curious enough to wait a heartbeat longer. The bailiff, positioned near the bench, instinctively stepped forward, but a sharp glance from Judge Mills froze him in place. "Let her be," the judge said softly, more to himself than to anyone else. Across the aisle, Adia Nora Reeves caught the scene in full clarity. Her legal mind clicked into overdrive. She jotted a quick note on her pad. Dog's reaction critical. Trust it. Victor's confident smile faltered just slightly as he shifted in his seat. His lawyer noticed but said nothing. After all, they had prepared for this. A child who couldn't speak? An adorable dog meant to manipulate emotions, easy obstacles, or so they had thought. Lena reached the witness chair. It was too large for her. She climbed into it awkwardly, her legs dangling far above the floor. Claire Brooks, her mother, remained seated close by but was prohibited from standing next to her. Rules were rules, even when a 5-year-old's silence was all that separated a predator from freedom. Shadow sat down at Lena's feet, still stiff, eyes never leaving Victor Lane. Judge Mills cleared his throat. "Miss Brooks," he said, voice gentler than usual. "You're safe here. You don't have to say anything you don't want to, just do what feels right." The room exhaled as one, yet the tension remained suffocating. Journalists scribbled feverishly, their pens scratching against notepads. Every second scratched thin, taut like a violin string pulled to its limit. Victor Lane leaned back in his chair, forcing a casual posture, but the small bead of sweat trickling down his temple betrayed the charade. He knew Dog. More importantly, he knew this dog knew him. Not from fleeting court appearances or secondhand exposure. No, Shadow knew something deeper, something more damning. Lena lowered her head, letting her curls fall like a veil over her face. Her free hand clenched and unclenched atop the wooden armrest, a trembling rhythm of fear and resilience. Shadow, responding to her unspoken turmoil, leaned gently against her shin, a silent gesture, a bond beyond words. On the bench, Judge Mills scribbled a note of his own. "Request animal behavioral expert if needed. Shadow's behavior is possibly evidentiary." He circled the word shadow twice. Victor shifted again, legs crossing and uncrossing beneath the table. His attorney shot him a warning glance, but Victor didn't seem to notice. Across the room, Agent Ethan Cole, lead investigator, observed quietly. His instincts screamed something had already gone wrong for the defense. Cole's experience told him when a predator smelled fear. Today it was the prey, the dog that smelled something first. Claire Brooks, from her seat, mouthed silent encouragement to her daughter. "Breathe, sweetheart, you're not alone." But Lena's gaze was far away, lost in the echo of a trauma too vast for words. The courtroom clerk called for opening statements, yet no one moved immediately. It was as if the ritualistic rhythm of law had been interrupted by something ancient, something older than courts and gavels, something primal, feral. Truth didn't always scream. Sometimes it growled. In that charged silence, Lena did something unexpected. She reached down and gripped Shadow's thick fur, pulling herself upright a little more. She still said nothing, but the act spoke volumes. She was grounding herself, drawing courage from the one soul who had never betrayed her. And Victor Lane watched, his hand now tapping a furious rhythm against the polished table. Tap, 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 the music of a man realizing that for the first time, his carefully constructed lies were cracking under the weight of something he couldn't manipulate. Loyalty. Judge Mills finally banged his gavel. "Opening statements will proceed," he announced. But his eyes never once left the trembling child and the battle-scarred dog by her side. The murmur of the courtroom barely returned to life as Adia Nora Reeves rose from her seat, a slim folder in her hand, her heels clicking softly against the floor. Her expression was composed, but those who knew her well could detect the slight tightening of her jaw, the glint of steely resolve in her eyes. She approached the jury with deliberate grace, knowing that every syllable she was about to utter had the power to sway hearts, to anchor doubt, or to ignite. Behind her, Lena Brooks sat motionless in the oversized witness chair, one small hand tangled deep in the thick fur of Shadow, who remained tense, his gaze never once leaving Victor Lane. The air was still heavy, laden with the unspoken weight of 1,000 fears, 1,000,000 suspicions. Nora cleared her throat softly. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice firm but warm. "Today you will hear a story. It is a story about a predator who walked our streets, blending in, hiding behind the mask of normalcy, waiting for the moment he could strike. And it is a story about a little girl who, despite unspeakable fear, found a way to bring him into the light." Every word dropped like a pebble into a... Victor Lane's smile had vanished. He now stared straight ahead, his hands clasped tightly on the table in front of him. Nora continued, carefully laying the groundwork for the case, detailing the timeline of Lena's abduction attempt, the witness statements gathered, the partial license plate identified by an elderly neighbor. It was a narrative meticulously constructed to weave together the pieces of a dark puzzle. Pieces that only now, with Lena's silent strength and Shadow's feral intuition, were beginning to fit together. In the audience, Martha Jenkins, the retired nurse who had called 911 the day of the attack, shifted in her seat. Her fingers nervously twisted the edge of her scarf, her face pale. As Nora paused to allow the gravity of her words to sink in, Martha's hand shot up slightly, just a twitch, but enough to catch Judge Mills's sharp eyes. Your Honor, Nora said quickly. Picking up on the movement, with your permission, I would like to call an additional witness to clarify a point in the timeline. Mills nodded. Proceed, he said, his voice low but firm. Martha rose unsteadily and made her way to the stand, her every step wrapped in the weight of memory. She was sworn in swiftly, and Nora approached her with a gentle kindness that encouraged confidence. Mrs. Jenkins, she asked, could you tell the court what you saw that afternoon? Martha nodded, her voice quavering. I was walking my dog across the street from the Brooks house. I saw a black van parked near the curb, the side door slightly open. There was a man. The room was dead silent. Can you describe anything unusual about the man or the vehicle? Nora pressed carefully. Martha hesitated, her brow furrowing as she dug through her memories. Then it happened. Yes, she said, voice gaining strength. After he saw me looking, he stood up quickly. I saw him reach into the van and Nora's pulse quickened. She smiled softly. Thank you, Mrs. Jenkins. No further questions. The defense immediately objected, arguing memory contamination, but Judge Mills overruled after a moment's deliberation. The crack had appeared. The perfect defense Victor had hidden behind was showing its first real fracture. Victor's jaw tapped visibly, his hand resuming the restless tapping against the table's underside, a staccato rhythm of unraveling composure. Meanwhile, Lena remained still, her small body dwarfed by the massive wooden structure of the stand. Her face was pale, almost translucent under the harsh fluorescent lights, but her eyes, those fierce green eyes, burned with a silent fire. As Nora returned to her seat and the next procedural motions unfolded, Lena suddenly twitched. Shadow immediately pressed closer to her leg, his presence a tether in the emotional storm swirling around them. Then, without warning, Lena's lips moved. No microphone could have caught the whisper, but Shadow heard it. He froze, ears snapping forward, body rigid as a board. Claire Brooks leaned forward in her seat instinctively, her heart hammering against her ribs. Nora noticed it too, her pen pausing mid-stroke. Slid into the courtroom like a blade between ribs. Lena whispered, so faint it could have been breath. Puppy, one single word, a single memory, a single crack wide enough to shatter everything Victor Lane had tried to build. Nora's mind raced. Puppy. The word fit. The reports they had compiled, the pattern they had suspected, strangers offering puppies to lure children into vans. Victor had used it. Victor had spoken those words to Lena. Victor had tried to steal her life with a lie wrapped in the shape of innocence. Shadow let out a low, barely audible whine, pressing harder against Lena's side. On the defense table, Martin Shaw scribbled a frantic note and shoved it towards Victor, who now sat so stiffly he looked like a statue carved out of ice. His breathing had changed faster, harsher, though he tried desperately to conceal it. Nora caught Judge Mills' glance and knew he had heard it too. Not the word itself, but the shift in the room, the unseen quake that followed it. Shadow had heard the truth, and through him, so had they. Victor shifted again, hands balling into fists under the table, muscles straining against his neatly pressed suit. Shaw whispered furiously at him, but Victor didn't respond. He stared at Lena with a mixture of hatred and fear, as if seeing not a small girl but a force he could no longer control. The bailiff adjusted his stance subtly, sensing the tension rising like a gathering storm. Reporters exchanged wide-eyed looks. Pens scribbled furiously across notepads. Ada Reeves smiled slightly to herself, the kind of smile that came not from triumph but from the grim satisfaction of truth breaking surface after too long underwater. Yet despite the tremors starting to rock the courtroom, Lena remained eerily calm. She clung to Shadow, her voice lost again but her spirit loud, defiant. She had uttered her first word, a clue embedded in terror, wrapped in memory, pulled from the deepest recesses of her wounded heart. Victor Lane knew it too, knew that the dominoes had begun to fall. His fingers gripped the edge of the table, whitening with the effort of holding himself together, but the cracks were showing, in him, in his defense, in his facade, and it was only the beginning. The courtroom's tension hung thick, as if every breath drawn by its occupants strained against invisible walls. Ada Nora Reeves retreated quietly to her table, her mind racing through strategies for the next phase. Lena Brooks sat frozen in her chair, small fingers woven into Shadow's rough fur. Her body language a study in quiet resistance. Victor Lane's composure cracked visibly now. His eyes darted around the room with the furtive twitch of a trapped animal. He leaned toward his attorney, Martin Shaw, whispering sharply under his breath, though nothing could drown out the rising tide of dread that had begun to swell within these walls. Judge Warren Mills took a long, considered look at the child and the dog before he addressed the court, his voice low but commanding. Before proceeding, the court will allow additional context from the child's family to better understand her current condition. His gavel struck once, a sound more solemn than sharp. Claire Brooks rose from the second row, every movement deliberate, as if each step toward the stand carried the full weight of her daughter's shattered innocence. She was sworn in quickly, her gaze never wavering from her daughter as she took her seat. Nora approached, her voice softened to a near murmur. "Mrs. Brooks, can you please describe Lena's condition following the incident?" Claire exhaled slowly, steeling herself. "Your daughter didn't just stop speaking," she said, her words trembling at the edges. She lost her connection to the world. Days blurred together for her. She couldn't tell morning from night. She didn't know where she was half the time. It's like the clock in her mind broke. A hush fell deeper across the room. Even the scribbling journalists paused. Nora nodded gently. "And how has her connection with Shadow helped her?" Claire's lips twitched in a faint, bittersweet smile. "He became her anchor. Without him, I don't think she would even know she was still here." As Claire spoke, Shadow's ears perked slightly, his body tensing, but not from comfort. His nose twitched in short, rapid bursts, his breathing sharpening with each intake. Nora noticed her instincts firing like electricity along her spine. Without waiting for prompting, Shadow stood up, muscles taut, nose pointed directly at Victor Lane across the room. A low, dangerous rumble started deep in the shepherd's chest, unleashed itself with a terrifying elegance. Shadow had picked up a scent, something raw, metallic, something that clung stubbornly to Victor's clothes even after all this time. It was the smell of blood, old and faint but unmistakable to a dog trained to track the wounded, and the guilty. Victor shifted in his seat, brushing unconsciously at his jacket sleeve as if feeling a phantom touch. Shadow advanced a single step, so slow, so deliberate that even the bailiff hesitated before reacting. Nora locked eyes with Judge Mills, whose gaze hardened into something grim. There would be no objections strong enough to erase the primal testimony now offered by the most honest witness in the room. Victor coughed lightly, feigning nonchalance, but the tremor in his hand betrayed him. Claire's breath caught audibly, and for a second it seemed she might break down completely. Instead, she squared her shoulders, drawing on reserves of strength forged in nights filled with her daughter's silent nightmares. "There's something else," she said, her voice rough. "About a week ago, Lena started drawing again." Nora arched a brow, intrigued. "Drawing?" she prompted. Claire nodded. "At first, we thought it was good progress, but then we looked closer." She reached into her purse and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, smoothing it carefully on the witness stand. Nora accepted the page and turned it for the jury to see. The drawing was crude, the messy scribbles of a traumatized child, but its meaning cut sharper than any expert testimony ever could. There, rendered in stark black crayon against a background of frantic lines, was the shape of a man tall, hunched slightly, with long arms that seemed to stretch far beyond normal proportions. His face was nothing more than a smudge of darkness, but the unmistakable outline of a van lurked behind him. Flashed across the courtroom without mercy. Several jurors leaned forward unconsciously. ADA Nora Reeves felt a shiver trace down her spine. The figure was too distinct to be coincidence. Lena had drawn her monster, and he sat barely 20 feet away, hiding behind a lawyer in a polished suit. Victor Lane paled visibly, his hand dropping limply to his side, the cocky arrogance he had flaunted evaporating like mist under the noonday sun. Martin Shaw whispered furiously to him, but Victor's gaze was locked on the drawing, a grotesque mirror held up to his soul. Judge Mills leaned in, tapping his pen thoughtfully against his notepad. "Is there anyone else," he asked dryly, "who could have inspired this image?" Claire shook her head firmly. "She's been home. Only family, no strangers, no new shows, no scary movies. This is not her imagination." Her voice broke slightly. "It's memory." Victor slumped further into his chair, his pulse visibly hammering against the vein in his neck. Across the aisle, Agent Ethan Cole wrote a single word on his notepad: Predator. Nora Reeves stood silently for a long moment, letting the weight of the evidence settle over the jury like a burial shroud. Then she turned back to Claire. "Thank you, Mrs. Brooks. No further questions for now." Claire gathered the drawing carefully, casting one last look at her daughter, a look filled with pride and sorrow intertwined before stepping down. As she passed Lena's seat, she allowed her hand to brush lightly against the back of the chair, a silent message of courage. Lena's eyes remained fixed ahead, her hand still buried in Shadow's fur. The German Shepherd vibrated with restrained energy, his instincts screaming warnings that no human courtroom could fully understand. And somewhere, deep inside the labyrinth of her fractured mind, Lena Brooks remembered more than she let on. The courtroom buzzed with a charged undercurrent, an invisible current that pulsed between the wooden walls and stone pillars. As Claire Brooks stepped down from the witness stand, her testimony and the haunting drawing her daughter had created clung to every mind like mist on a cold morning. Lena remained seated, her tiny body half folded into the reassuring mass of Shadow at her feet. Her fingers tightly wound into his fur as though she could anchor herself to him and prevent the memories from swallowing her whole. The gavel struck once more, a sharp note in the loaded air, as Judge Mills signaled for proceedings to continue. Ada Nora Reeves rose with practiced calm and introduced the next set of exhibits into evidence. Photographs of the van, forensic reports on fibers found at the scene, the partial license plate that Martha Jenkins had remembered. Yet even as evidence mounted methodically, it was not legal procedure that gripped the room. It was the primal, unseen battle playing out between a predator and his would-be prey. Lena's eyes were distant, glazed with the shimmer of unshed tears, but her hand never released Shadow. As Nora spoke, laying out timelines and expert witness findings, Victor Lane leaned back in his chair with a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. He crossed one leg casually over the other, feigning disinterest, yet every now and then his gaze flicked sideways toward Lena, toward Shadow, and that was when it happened, folded in chilling silence. As Lena shifted slightly in her seat, turning inadvertently to face Victor head-on, Shadow froze. One instant he was a breathing wall of comfort, the next he had transformed into a coiled spring of tension, every muscle locked, his body trembling with restrained aggression. His nose twitched once, twice, then ceased all movement altogether. His deep brown eyes bored into Victor Lane, unblinking, unyielding. The jurors noticed immediately. The jury forewoman leaned forward, clutching the armrest as if needing physical support for the moment's weight. Even Judge Mills set down his pen slowly, no longer pretending detachment. In a courtroom that valued spoken testimony above all else, it was a silent verdict being rendered by instincts older and purer than any human system of justice. Shadow was not just recognizing fear or anger, he was recognizing a scent, a memory tied to violence and terror, a signature of guilt embedded in Victor Lane's very skin. Victor tensed imperceptibly, his jaw clenching, his fingers drumming a frantic, arrhythmic beat against his knee. His smug exterior began to crumble, sweat glistening faintly at his hairline despite the air-conditioned chill of the room. Martin Shaw noticed, whispering furiously to maintain composure, but Victor waved him off with a twitch of his hand, his own facade slipping fast. Meanwhile, Lena tightened her grip on Shadow's fur, leaning into him until her forehead rested lightly against his back, finding strength in the silent communication between them. Nora Reeves, sensing the shift, paused her legal arguments, letting the raw, unspeakable moment breathe, knowing instinctively that some truths needed no words to devastate. Shadow's stare remained unwavering, a sentinel before the gates of innocence, a silent sentinel pointing out the true face of evil. The gallery was stone still, the air thick as syrup. Reporters ceased scribbling, spectators stopped breathing. For one blinding moment, the law's cold mechanisms yielded to something primal, something absolutely undeniable. Then came the second blow. The hidden revelation lying dormant until now burst onto the scene, shattering the fragile facade Victor had clung to. It happened subtly, almost laughably mundane, as Victor shifted nervously, Adjusting his sleeve, the cuff of his tailored jacket rode up just enough to reveal a jagged scar etched along his left forearm. The mark was unmistakable, the crescent curve of a dog's bite, still livid after what must have been months of healing. Several jurors gasped audibly. One young woman covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with horrified recognition. Nora's gaze sharpened, predatory. She made no move to highlight the discovery yet, allowing the jurors to absorb the shock organically, allowing the seed of certainty to take root in their minds before she gave it voice. Across the aisle, Ethan Cole scribbled furiously into his notebook, a quick, urgent motion that spoke volume. Victor Lane noticed the attention his arm had drawn only too late. His attempt to tug the sleeve down was clumsy, panicked, betraying the instinctive terror that now gripped him. Martin Shaw leaned in, his face a mask of controlled fury, whispering something urgent that Victor ignored. His focus was entirely on Lena, on the dog that had marked him, on the past that refused to stay buried. The shadow emitted a sound that was not a growl nor a bark, but something deeper, almost mournful, a low rumble vibrating through the floorboards and up into the bones of every witness present. The message was clear. I know you, I remember. Nora Reeves allowed herself a single deep breath before stepping forward again. She didn't mention the scar, not yet. She didn't need to. The jury had seen it. And, most importantly, Lena had seen it too. Her eyes sharpening for the first time in days, narrowing with something fierce, something closer to recognition than fear. Judge Mills leaned back slowly, his hands steepled before him, expression unreadable but thoughts racing. His instincts, honed through decades of trials and human folly, told him they were standing at the threshold of a tipping point. But caution reigned. He would allow the prosecution to weave the noose tighter before calling for any dramatic reveals. Victor's breathing grew ragged, chest rising and falling with visible effort. Sweat beaded along his brow now, soaking into his neatly pressed collar. His leg jiggled uncontrollably beneath the table, a silent metronome counting down to inevitable collapse. Shadow never blinked, never moved. He remained a living accusation etched into flesh and memory, refusing to look away. Lena, feeling the subtle shift in the room, lifted her head from Shadow's back. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, found Victor's, and for a heartbeat too long they locked. The predator and the prey. Except the lines blurred now, because it was not Lena who shrank from the gaze. It was Victor. The moment snapped like a taut wire. Judge Mills cleared his throat gruffly. "Proceed," he commanded, though his voice lacked its usual firmness, as if part of him knew that nothing proceeding would be quite the same anymore. Nora Reeves smiled thinly, her next words sharpening like knives against the hush. The gavel's last echo barely faded when Agent Ethan Cole received the silent nod from Judge Mills to proceed with a warrant execution. No words were needed. The cumulative weight of evidence, the drawing, the scar, and the visceral response from Shadow had stacked too heavily against Victor Lane. The law moved swiftly when it finally decided to strike. That afternoon, the FBI convoy cut through the rural outskirts, leaving the sleek civility of the courthouse behind and plunging into the wildness of abandoned farmland and neglected woods. The black SUVs rumbled down an unmarked dirt path, the sunlight struggling to pierce the thick canopy overhead. Shadow rode in the back seat beside Lena and Claire, his body rigid with anticipation. His nose twitched constantly, his ears erect, his muscles ready to spring. There was no hesitation in him. Lena, though silent, rested one hand against Shadow's back, grounding herself through him once again. Beside her, Claire fought against the nausea rising in her throat. She knew they were heading toward something terrible, something that would demand all the strength they had left. The cabin emerged like a wound upon the land, an ugly, squat structure of rotting wood and rusted nails. It sat sunken into the earth as though trying to hide itself from the world. Weeds clawed up its sides, and the remnants of a broken porch sagged under the weight of years of abandonment. Agent Cole raised a fist, and the team fanned out into formation. Shadow growled low in his throat, a sound that rippled through the team's earpieces and sent a synchronized shiver down spine. The air around the cabin felt wrong, thick with decay and something fouler lurking beneath. They approached cautiously. Cole gestured for the door to be breached. One swift kick from a burly agent sent the door splintering inward, revealing a dark, musty interior. The place reeked of mold, rust, and something else. Something metallic and faintly sweet. Blood. Shadow pulled at his leash, leading Claire, Lena, and a backup agent into the main room. Dust motes danced in the dim shafts of light breaking through cracks in the walls. There were no signs of life, but Shadow's tension only grew. He circled the room once, nose skimming the floorboards, and then abruptly stopped near the back wall, his nose pressing against a spot in the floor that seemed, at first glance, no different from any other, unfurled like a blade drawn from its sheath. Cole crouched down, knocking gently against the floorboards. Hollow. A quick pry with a crowbar revealed a trapdoor. It groaned open, releasing a stale, suffocating gust of cold air from below. Flashlights beamed into the darkness, illuminating a crude wooden staircase spiraling downwards. Shadow growled again, and without waiting bounded down into the darkness, his instincts guiding him unerringly. Claire followed with Lena in her arms, the other agents trailing close behind. The underground was worse than anyone had imagined. The main corridors split almost immediately into 3 separate tunnels, each one a black maw swallowing the light from their torches. 3 paths, 3 choices, 3 secrets waiting to be exhumed. Cole cursed under his breath. This was no simple hideout. It was a labyrinth designed to confuse, to isolate, to trap. Each tunnel represented a different chapter in the horror Victor Lane had written in blood and silence. Agents split into teams, each taking a tunnel. Shadow chose left without hesitation, his nose leading them through a narrow, twisting passage that eventually opened into a cramped underground chamber. The walls were damp and stained, the air thick with mildew that had stuck to the back of their throats. But it was not mildew alone that choked them. Scattered along the walls were children's shoes, small backpacks, faded toy-silent relics of lives interrupted. Claire clutched Lena tighter, her heart breaking anew with every step deeper into the nightmare. Meanwhile, in the center tunnel, another team uncovered something that froze their blood in their veins. Emerged from the gloom like a monster in a child's nightmare. Behind a false wall, they found a hidden room. At first glance, it resembled a grim laboratory. Industrial-strength bleach containers, chemical solvents, heavy-duty scrubbing equipment, and detailed manuals on removing biological traces. There were gloves, surgical tools, industrial-strength trash bags, and rolls of duct tape stacked neatly in plastic bins. The room was a shrine to eradication, a testament to the meticulous, monstrous mind of Victor Lane. He had not simply intended to abduct, he had intended to erase. Agent Cole arrived minutes later, his face carved into a mask of fury and revulsion. The implications were clear. This cabin wasn't just a lair, it was a machine designed to consume and obliterate evidence, to make children vanish as if they had never existed. Shadow whimpered once, the sound high and mournful, pressing his body against Lena's legs protectively. Shadow whimpered that urge to vomit, wrapping herself tighter around her daughter, shielding her from the full horror. Cole barked orders into his radio, summoning forensics and canine units immediately. Every inch of the cabin needed to be documented before any contamination could occur. Every fiber, every stain, every hair could mean the difference between justice and another life lost to the fog of evil that Victor Lane had carefully crafted. Shadow continued pacing restlessly, leading Lena along the perimeter of the underground space. His nose skimming low, he occasionally paused, huffed, and then moved again, as if tracking a trail too faint for human senses to detect. The other teams reported in with more findings. A second trapdoor under an old mattress revealing another grim tunnel, and further still, a locked steel door behind a panel in the third tunnel. The horrors were compounding, a spiderweb of suffering meticulously constructed. Cole swore again under his breath. They would need specialists to safely breach the steel door without risking loss of potential forensic evidence behind it. The scale of Victor's depravity was more vast than even their darkest assumptions. Above ground, the evening sun dipped low, staining the sky a vicious orange-red as the agents worked under the looming threat of nightfall. Lena stayed close to Shadow's side, silent but fiercely awake, her eyes scanning every shadow, every shifting beam of light. Somewhere deep inside, she understood. This place was where monsters came to hide their crime, and Shadow, faithful and scarred, would not let them remain hidden. The sun rose sluggishly over the courthouse, casting long, bloody streaks of light through the narrow windows, as if the building itself bled for the crimes it was about to confront. Inside, the courtroom hummed with a grim energy. Every seat was filled, every spectator taut with anticipation. Victor Lane sat at the defense table, his posture impeccable, his suit crisp, his expression carved into a mask of indifference. To the casual observer, he appeared the epitome of calm, a man wrongly accused awaiting his vindication. But those who had seen what lay beneath the cabin knew better. They knew the darkness that dressed itself in the garments of normalcy. Shadow sat at Lena's feet, his head high, his body vibrating with a low, barely contained energy. Lena herself seemed unchanged, silent and withdrawn, her hand resting possessively on Shadow's ruff. Claire Brooks sat behind them, her hands knotted tightly together in her lap, whispering silent prayers to gods she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. As the proceedings resumed, Judge Mills entered and took his seat with a visible weight on his shoulders. The evidence from the cabin had been entered into the record under seal, pending additional forensic verification. But everyone in that room knew the truth could not stay hidden for long. ADA Nora Reeves stood with her usual precision, beginning the morning session with a recap of the prior day's findings. The forensic photos, the recovered items, the underground tunnels, it was all laid out with clinical, devastating clarity. Yet Victor Lane remained motionless, unflinching, except for one telling detail. Every time he shifted his gaze toward Lena, Shadow responded, erupted with relentless persistence. Each time Victor dared to glance at Lena, Shadow would stiffen, his hackles rising, a deep rumble emanating from his chest. It wasn't a single incident. It was a pattern, undeniable and chilling. First a low growl, then a lip curl, then a tense half-rise from his seated position, held back only by the leash wrapped firmly around Lena's small wrist. The jury noticed. The judge noticed. Even the journalists, seasoned and jaded, leaned forward in their seats, their pens temporarily forgotten. The Shadow was not reacting out of training or fear. He was reacting out of recognition, a primal certainty that this man was a threat, had been a threat, and would always be a threat. Victor shifted uncomfortably, trying to ignore the low, reverberating sound that seemed to fill the room every time his eyes dared to meet Lena's. His attorney, Martin Shaw, leaned over and muttered something sharp, likely an admonition to maintain eye contact with the judge instead of the girl. Victor tried, but the compulsion to glance back was too strong, too instinctive, like a moth drawn to its executioner's flame. Shadow's rumble deepened, vibrating through the floorboards. Judge Mills rapped his gavel once. "Control your animal, Miss Reeves," he said without real conviction, for he knew as well as everyone else that Shadow was not out of control. Shadow was simply refusing to allow evil to go unchallenged. Nora nodded respectfully, but made no move to truly restrain Shadow. Instead, she turned to her next witness, her voice steady. "Your Honor, the prosecution calls Maya Ellis to the stand." A collective shudder swept through the courtroom. Maya Ellis, the little girl rescued from beneath the earth, the living proof of Victor Lane's atrocities. Maya, thin and pale but defiant, walked slowly to the stand, her small body draped in a navy blue sweater several sizes too large, as if she needed the extra fabric to armor herself against the world. She climbed into the witness chair with effort, her eyes darting nervously around the room until they landed on Shadow and Lena. Seeing them seemed to bolster her, to remind her she wasn't alone. Nora approached carefully, crouching slightly to make herself less imposing. "Hi, Maya," she said warmly. "You're very brave for being here. Do you feel okay to talk today?" Maya nodded once, quickly. Her voice, when it came, was a whisper, but it carried. She swallowed hard, then spoke. "He was nice at first. He said he had puppies." Her voice cracked slightly, but she pressed on, her small fists clenching tighter. He said, "Puppy, for you, be good," struck the courtroom like a silent bomb. The Vietnamese words, broken and clumsy in her mouth, hit harder than any forensic report ever could. It was a phrase twisted into a weapon, a sick perversion of comfort into a lure. Several jurors blanched. One woman dabbed at her eyes with a trembling hand. Nora glanced at Judge Mills, whose mouth had tightened into a hard line. Across the room, Victor Lane stiffened, color draining from his face. He opened his mouth as if to object, to protest, But Martin Shaw grabbed his arm under the table and squeezed hard, a silent warning that any outburst would only dig his grave deeper. Shadow let out another low, sustained growl, so deep it seemed to come from the earth itself. Lena pressed her forehead against his back, drawing strength from the vibration, from the unbreakable bond they shared. Maya continued, her words tumbling out in a rush now. He said if I was good, I could pick one to take home. He said they needed someone small like me. Her voice faltered. He grabbed my arm. He pulled me toward the van. She shuddered, the memory slicing through her anew. Nora stepped closer, lowering her voice to a gentle murmur. And what happened next, Maya? Maya's chin quivered. A lady yelled from across the street. He let go. He got scared. He drove away fast. She hugged herself tightly, rocking slightly in her chair. Nora nodded, her heart aching. You did so good, Maya. Thank you. She turned to the judge. You further questions at this time, Your Honor. Judge Mills nodded gravely. Witness may step down. Maya climbed down from the stand, moving like a wounded bird. But when she passed Lena and Shadow, she paused. She reached out tentatively, brushing her fingers against Shadow's thick fur. The shepherd licked her hand once, a silent oath of protection, and for the first time that day, Maya smiled. The courtroom remained utterly silent, wrapped in the gravity of truth made flesh and blood. Victor Lane sat rigid, trapped, the walls of his lies closing in inch by inch. Martin Shaw leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand across his mouth in frustration. He knew, as did everyone else, that the tide had turned irrevocably. And yet, the storm was only beginning. The courtroom sat suspended in a breathless silence, the air dense with the weight of what had just unfolded. Maya Ellis's trembling voice still seemed to echo against the high, cavernous walls. At the prosecution's table, Ada Nora Reeves shuffled her papers with a deliberate slowness, giving everyone in the room time to absorb the truth laid bare. Judge Mills sat unmoving, his weathered face betraying nothing, but his eyes sharpened with a predatory focus fixed on Victor Lane across the room. Victor himself looked smaller somehow, his once impeccable suit sagging slightly on his frame, his complexion ashen. The mask he had so carefully crafted was cracking along the edges. But it wasn't over. Not yet. At the witness stand, Lena Brooks remained unnervingly still. She hadn't spoken since her single whispered word days earlier, but the intensity blazing in her green eyes spoke volumes. Her tiny hand gripped the leash of Shadow with a ferocity far beyond her years, her knuckles whitening under the strain. Shadow stood tense beside her, his entire being tuned to her silent commands, his breathing shallow and measured, waiting. Claire Brooks, seated just behind her daughter, clutched the armrest of her chair so tightly that her nails dug deep into the worn wood, but she made no move, understanding on a primal level that something was about to happen that needed to happen. Victor Lane shifted uncomfortably under the weight of 100 eyes, his own darting to Lena instinctively, a mistake that cost him dearly. The connection sparked like flint against stone. Lena's gaze locked onto his with a force so raw and unfiltered that Victor recoiled slightly, a twitch he could not control. She sat like a statue for a beat longer, the tension ratcheting to a breaking point, then, without warning, exploded into being. Lena stood up from her chair with a suddenness that made half the courtroom jolt upright. Her movements were small, but they carried the weight of a hammer blow. With a fierce, defiant snarl twisting her small features, she yanked the leash free from her grip and hurled it across the room. The leash flew in a tight, arcing spiral, the heavy leather handle spinning through the charged air, before it landed with a sharp slap directly in front of Victor Lane. It struck the floor inches from his polished shoes, the sound louder than any gavel strike. The leash coiled at his feet like a snake poised to strike. Gasps erupted from the gallery, and even Judge Mills sat straighter, his eyes wide with something close to awe. Victor flinched back instinctively, his chair scraping noisily against the tile as he pushed himself away from the thing lying there. Shadow growled low and deep, the kind of growl that seemed to rise from some ancient well of judgment and fury. Martin Shaw shot to his feet immediately, sputtering a protest, but no one was listening. All eyes were riveted on the tiny girl who had, without a single word, just thrown down a gauntlet at the feet of her would-be captor. Lena's chest heaved with the effort of the act. Her small hands balled into fists at her sides. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just stared unblinking, daring him to deny her reality. In that moment, she was not a victim. She was a witness, a warrior, and her silent defiance screamed louder than any testimony ever could. Victor Lane paled even further, the blood draining from his face so quickly that beads of sweat broke out along his hairline. He stared at the leash as if it were a venomous creature, unable or unwilling to look away. His lips parted in a stammer, but no sound emerged. Martin Shaw placed a hand firmly on his client's shoulder, but Victor shook him off with a jerk. His carefully constructed facade was crumbling, piece by piece, in full view of the world. Then Shadow moved. Without needing a command, without a word spoken, the scarred German shepherd lifted his head high and opened his mouth in a long, mournful howl. Shattered the courtroom. The sound was unlike anything anyone there had ever heard. A piercing, soul-deep cry that filled the space from floor to rafters, vibrating through the walls and rattling the very foundations of the building. It was the sound of grief, of rage, of unhealed wounds ripped open anew. Victor Lane's reaction was instantaneous and catastrophic. He crumpled as if struck, his legs buckling under him. He slumped into his chair, his face contorting into a grotesque mask of fear and guilt. Tears streamed down his cheeks unchecked, and he clutched at the table as if it alone could keep him from drowning. Sobs racked his body, great heaving gasps that echoed grotesquely in the stunned silence of the courtroom. Every person present stared in shocked fascination as the mighty predator exposed himself for what he truly was. A coward masquerading as a monster, undone not by force or fury but by the sheer weight of undeniable truth. Lena remained standing, unmoving, her face set in grim resolution. Shadow's howl tapered off into a low, rumbling growl, the sound carrying a warning. The battle was not yet over. Judge Mills tapped his gavel sharply twice, but it was clear the proceeding had already slipped beyond the reach of mere decorum. ADA Nora Reeves rose slowly from her seat, her heart pounding, knowing that the trial had just shifted into territory no legal textbook could adequately describe. Martin Shaw leaned close to his client, hissing desperate instructions. But Victor shook his head violently, tears flying from his face. He covered his face with his hands, his body curling inward as if trying to make himself small, to disappear entirely. The courtroom was no longer simply a place of law. It had become an arena of reckoning, a battlefield where innocence and loyalty wielded greater power than any argument. Shadow resumed his place at Lena's side, pressing against her leg reassuringly. She rested her hand on his head, a small trembling touch, but filled with a determination that radiated outward. Victor Lane rocked back and forth slightly in his chair, whispering incoherently to himself, fragments of denials and apologies tumbling from his lips, none of them coherent, none of them enough. And yet, in the center of it all, Lena Brooks stood tall, silent, unbroken, the girl who had lost her voice but never her will. The courtroom remained wrapped in stunned silence long after Victor Lane's breakdown, a stillness so profound that every scrape of a chair and every rustle of fabric felt deafening. The carefully constructed facade Victor had worn for so long lay in ruins at his feet, and yet ADA Nora Reeves knew that emotion alone would not be enough to seal the verdict. The law demanded evidence, cold and irrefutable, and she was prepared to deliver it. Rising slowly from her seat, she gathered a thick folder of documents, each page a blade sharpened for the kill. Shadow sat alert at Lena's side, his eyes never straying from Victor, his breathing steady and low. Lena herself remained a sentinel of silence, her hands gripping the wooden arms of her chair so tightly that her knuckles had turned pale. Nora approached the jury with deliberate slowness, allowing the weight of the moment to settle before she spoke. Her voice, when it came, was measured and unwavering. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her tone carrying the steady rhythm of inevitability. "What you have witnessed here today is powerful, but now, I will show you proof so undeniable that not even the most eloquent defense can cast doubt upon it." She turned and held up the first piece of evidence, a series of high-utilization photographs projected onto the large screen beside the bench. The images displayed the undercarriage of Victor Lane's black van, taken immediately after his arrest. Nora allowed the jurors a moment to absorb the gritty details, the clumps of dried mud clinging to the wheel wells and lower chassis. She then clicked to the next slide. Soil samples extracted from the cabin's surrounding property. The dense clay-rich dirt unique to that specific rural region. She said, her voice slicing through the tension like a scalpel. Are the soil samples collected from Mr. Lane's vehicle? Another click. And these are the soil samples collected from the vicinity of the hidden cabin. Another pause, heavy and deliberate. Forensic analysis confirms with 100% certainty that the soil compositions are identical, including trace mineral anomalies specific to that location. Detonated across the courtroom like a landmine. The impact was immediate and visceral. Jurors leaned forward as one, eyes wide, pens frozen above notepads. A low murmur rose among the spectators, quickly quelled by a sharp glance from Judge Mills. Victor Lane's head dropped between his shoulders, his face draining of the last vestiges of color. Martin Shaw muttered under his breath, a stream of expletives barely concealed by his clenched jaw. Nora Reeves stepped back from the screen, letting the jury digest the bomb she had just dropped. Ladies and gentlemen, she continued, pacing slowly before the box. It is no coincidence that Mr. Lane's vehicle carries the very soil that encases a hidden layer designed to imprison and erase children from existence. It is evidence of proximity, of opportunity, and of guilt. Victor's breathing became shallow, erratic, his hands gripping the edges of the defense table as if he could anchor himself against the rising tide of doom. Shadow's low growl rumbled again, and this time even Judge Mills did not intervene. He understood now. They all did. But Nora was not finished. She closed the folder with a quiet, decisive snap and lifted another evidence packet from her briefcase, one sealed with a red tamper-proof sticker. The prosecution also presents biological evidence recovered from the scene, she said, her voice steady but electric with suppressed energy. She handed the packet to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge for inspection before it was passed to the jury. Inside were high-definition photographs of the duct tape, ropes, and shackles recovered from the basement rooms of the cabin. Swabs had been taken meticulously, samples preserved according to the strictest forensic standards. Nora waited until the jurors had the images before them, until their hands trembled with the awful weight of what they now held. DNA analysis, Nora said, her voice dropping to a solemn register, confirmed the presence of Mr. Lane's genetic material on multiple surfaces inside the cabin. His DNA was found on the binding restraints used to secure Maya Ellis. His DNA was found on the floorboards, stained with blood near the first underground chamber. And most damningly, his DNA was recovered from the interior of the hidden room designed explicitly to destroy biological evidence. Slammed into the courtroom with the force of a tidal wave. Audible gasps echoed through the chamber, several jurors visibly recoiling from the photographs and reports in their hands. One elderly man removed his glasses, wiping his eyes with a trembling hand. The gallery buzzed with horrified whispers before being silenced again by a curt rap of Judge Mills' gavel. Victor Lane buried his face in his hands, his shoulders quaking. Martin Shaw rose halfway out of his seat, as if preparing to object, but no words came. There was no objection strong enough, no denial loud enough to drown out the roar of the truth now thundering through the courtroom. Nora Reeves stood tall, her face a mask of grim satisfaction. She had seen many trials in her career, seen the guilty squirm and writhe in posture, but few moments carried the raw, irrefutable finality of this one. She turned slightly, glancing toward Lena and Shadow. Lena's face was unreadable, her green eyes glowing with something fierce and terrible. Shadow sat unmoving, his gaze locked onto Victor with a predator's patience. Judge Mills leaned forward, his voice heavy with the authority of someone who knew the end was close. Defense may cross-examine, he said, though the weight of his tone suggested he found the exercise largely academic at this point. Martin Shaw stumbled through procedural motions, his voice dry and mechanical, but it was clear even he no longer believed in his own arguments. The jury sat like statues, their faces pale and hard. They had seen the evidence. They had heard the howl of a dog mourning the innocence lost. They had watched a predator fall to his knees under the weight of a child's silent rage. And still, somehow, the final blow had yet to fall. The courtroom felt heavier with every passing second. the air so saturated with tension that it was a wonder anyone could breathe at all. Ada Nora Reeves returned to her seat, her closing evidence hanging in the atmosphere like a guillotine suspended by a single fraying thread. Across the aisle, Martin Shaw sat stone-faced, futilely rifling through paperwork as if searching for a lifeline that did not exist. Victor Lane remained hunched over, his face a mask of defeat, his breath coming in ragged gasps. No cross-examination, no rebuttal, no strategic delay could save him now. The truth had breached the gates he had fortified for so long, and the tide was rushing in to drown him. Lena Brooks remained seated at the witness stand, shadow pressed firmly against her side, the only steadying force in a world that had cracked wide open. Her small hands rested on her knees, her posture rigid but composed, as though she understood, perhaps better than anyone else, that something monumental was about to happen. Claire Brooks watched her daughter with tears brimming in her eyes, afraid to move, afraid to even breathe too loudly lest she disturb the fragile, extraordinary moment coalescing before them. The judge's gavel struck lightly once more, calling the court to the final phase, but no one moved immediately. It was as if the room itself knew that words had become almost meaningless in the face of what had just transpired. And then, without warning, Lena shifted. She rose slowly to her feet, her small figure unfolding from the chair with a quiet, deliberate grace that drew every gaze in the room like iron filings to a magnet, forth with a force no one could have anticipated. Lena lifted her head, her bright green eyes locked onto Shadow with an intensity that vibrated through the floorboards, through the very bones of those present. And in a voice that trembled but did not falter, she spoke, "Shadow, here." The words rang out, sharp and crystalline against the hushed stillness, a simple command made extraordinary by the fact that it was the first time Lena had truly spoken aloud since the day her world had shattered. The effect was electric. Several jurors gasped audibly. Nora Reeves gripped the edge of her table to steady herself. Even Judge Mills blinked rapidly, clearing his throat against a sudden, unexpected tightness. Lena's voice, small yet resonant, carried the weight of survival, of defiance, of the reclamation of a power that had been stolen from her. She had not merely survived, she had risen. Shadow responded instantly. He moved with a fluid grace, stepping forward with the same calm assurance he had once used to lead officers through the most dangerous corridors of the city's darkest nights. His body was low but purposeful, his every step deliberate as he advanced down the aisle. His gaze never wavered from Victor Lane, who sat frozen in place, terror etched deep into every line of his face. Victor tried to shift backward, his chair scraping loudly across the floor, but his movements were clumsy, panicked, a man attempting to outrun judgment itself. Detonated in the next heartbeat. As Shadow closed the distance, Victor Lane's fragile composure shattered completely. He tried to rise, but his knees buckled, sending him crashing back into his chair. His arms flailed helplessly, knocking his papers to the floor, scattering the last remnants of his defense like dry leaves before a storm. A choked sob escaped Victor's lips as Shadow stood just feet away, his eyes gleaming with a fierce, knowing light. Victor's body crumpled inward, his head hanging low, his chest heaving with broken, rasping breaths. His lawyer placed a frantic hand on his shoulder, attempting to steady him, but Victor shook it off, retreating even further into himself. The mighty predator was no more. In his place sat a broken, whimpering man, exposed for all the world to see. Lena stood tall at the witness stand, her eyes never leaving Victor. There was no triumph in her gaze, no gloating satisfaction, only the quiet, solemn acknowledgement that she had faced the monster in the dark and had refused to be consumed by him. Shadow remained still, a sentinel forged from scars and loyalty, his presence a living testament to resilience. Judge Mills leaned forward slowly, his gavel forgotten in his hand, observing the collapse with a mixture of professional detachment and deeply personal satisfaction. He knew he was witnessing something far greater than a legal victory. He was witnessing a triumph of the human spirit, a reclamation of dignity so profound that it defied even the cold sterility of legal procedure. Nora Reeves watched too, her throat tight with unshed emotion. She had fought battles in courtrooms before, had stood against liars and manipulators, but this was different. This was not merely a case closed. It was a life restored. Victor Lane hunched lower, burying his face in his hands, his body racked by silent sobs. The jury watched, unmoving, their faces hardening with each passing second. The evidence had damned him, but it was the child he had tried to destroy, and the dog who had never left her side, that had ultimately broken him. Claire Brooks pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, her tears now flowing freely. Beside her, several spectators openly wept, unable to contain the tide of emotions crashing through the room. Shadow stood like a stone, his body tense but patient, awaiting Lena's next move, ready to follow wherever she led. And Lena, the girl who had once vanished into silence, stood unbowed in the place where monsters fell. The courtroom exhaled as Victor Lane sagged completely into his chair, defeated and destroyed in full view of the world he had once prowled so confidently. The proceedings, once clinical and methodical, had transformed into something raw and human, a final reckoning that no statute book could have truly prepared them for. Judge Mills adjusted his robes, his face carved from granite, and after a long, heavy silence he spoke. Victor Lane, having been found guilty on all charges brought against you, including attempted abduction, unlawful imprisonment, and multiple counts of child endangerment, this court sentences you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. His gavel came down with a resounding crack that echoed through the chamber like a cannon shot. In that instant it was done. No appeals, no second chances. Victor Lane would die behind bars, and the world outside those prison walls would continue on without him, lighter somehow for his absence. Victor made no response. He sat slumped over, his face buried in his hands, his body convulsing with silent, broken sobs. Martin Shaw gathered the remnants of their defense in silence, his movements mechanical and hollow. Across the aisle, the gallery erupted into a storm of emotions. Some people wept openly, others embraced, while still others simply sat in stunned silence, too overwhelmed to react at all. Lena remained standing at the witness stand, her hand resting on Shadow's head, her posture regal in its quiet strength. Claire Brooks rushed to her daughter's side, dropping to her knees and wrapping Lena in a fierce, trembling embrace. But even in her mother's arms, Lena kept one hand firmly on Shadow, grounding herself through him, anchoring herself to the living symbol of her survival. Ada Nora Reeves stood still, absorbing the moment with a deep, slow breath. She had won cases before, but none had ever tasted quite like this. It was not simply justice that had been served. It was something greater, a reclamation of light from the clutches of unrelenting darkness. Reporters flooded the steps outside the courthouse, cameras flashing like lightning, microphones thrust forward in search of reactions. But inside, a more intimate scene unfolded. The families of the victims gathered together, forming a loose circle of shared grief and tentative hope. Among them stood Maya Ellis, her hand tightly gripping her mother's. She looked smaller than ever, pale and exhausted, but her eyes glowed with a stubborn, unbreakable light. A journalist knelt beside her, gently asking if she wanted to say anything. Maya hesitated, then nodded, her voice quiet but clear. "When I was in that place," she said, her words trembling on the edge of memory, "I was scared all the time. It was dark and it smelled bad, and sometimes I thought I was going to disappear forever." Her mother squeezed her hand encouragingly, and Maya continued, her eyes shining. "But then, one night I heard a sound, a dog, a long howl like he was calling out to me, and I knew someone was looking for me. I wasn't forgotten." Rippled through the crowd with profound impact. The reporters fell silent, their pens and cameras forgotten for a moment as the weight of Maya's words settled over them. Claire Brooks wept openly now, clutching Lena closer, and even the hardened FBI agents in attendance found their vision blurring. Shadow sat proudly beside Lena, as if understanding that his voice had carried farther than any searchlight, had pierced through the darkness to plant a seed of hope in a soul teetering on the brink of despair. Maya's simple, powerful statement traveled farther than anyone realized. By the evening news cycle, it would have touched millions, reminding a weary world that sometimes survival hinged not on grand gestures, but on small, steadfast signs that life and love still searched for the lost. Inside the courtroom, as people began to trickle out, hugging and crying and promising to stay in touch, one scene remained frozen in its own sacred orbit. Lena turned toward Shadow, her tiny hands still buried in his thick fur. She knelt down so that she was eye level with him, her green eyes wide and glistening with unshed tears. Her lip trembled, but she did not falter. She leaned forward and wrapped her arms around Shadow's scarred neck, burying her face against him, drawing from him one final, infinite comfort. And then, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, she spoke the words that would etch themselves forever into the memory of everyone who heard them. "You saved me, always," unfolded with a heartbreaking grace that no one could withstand. Shadow closed his eyes, leaning into her embrace with a contented sigh, his tail thumping softly against the floor. It was a vow, a thank you, and a goodbye all wrapped into one. The final act of a bond forged in darkness and strengthened by light. Claire crouched beside them, her tears falling freely now, pressing a kiss to the crown of Lena's head. Nora Reeves stood by the door, watching the tableau with a reverence usually reserved for cathedrals and sacred places. Outside, the clouds that had loomed heavy all morning began to break apart, revealing slender beams of golden sunlight piercing through the gray. A fresh breeze stirred the flags hanging limply above the courthouse, setting them fluttering in a triumphant dance. The reporters shouted questions, but no one rushed Lena or Claire. Some moments were too sacred for interruption. Hand in hand, with Shadow leading them into the sunlight, Lena and her mother walked slowly down the courthouse steps. The war was not over for Lena. There would be nightmares still, flashbacks and fears to battle in the long nights ahead. But the darkest battle had been fought and won. And now, for the first time in what felt like forever, she could see the path forward not as a place of shadows, but as a landscape lit by resilience, love, and hope. The world was still broken in places, it always would be, but standing there in the fading golden light, with Shadow at her side and her mother's hand in hers, Lena knew one unshakable truth: the darkness had not won. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more powerful stories that stay with you long after they end. I'd love to hear what part of Lena's journey resonated with you the most. Was it the moment she spoke again, or the bond she shared with Shadow that struck you hardest? Also, let me know where you're watching from. It's always incredible to see how far these stories can travel. Share your thoughts in the comments. I'll be reading each one carefully.